my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day and welcome back to Quilted and Bound. This is a fun video and article series put together with Quiltmaker magazine and the Grace Company. In this video, we're going to learn how to quilt with pantographs in 5 easy steps. These are printed paper patterns that allow us to quilt from the back of our frame and cover our quilts with a single all-over quilting design. So let's get started. Step 1 is to mark our quilting space. I've attached a laser light to my long arm and have rolled the machine as far back as it can go on the frame. Now I've placed a piece of tape underneath where that laser light is pointing on the back table. Now I'm going to roll the machine down, making sure that that tape stays nice and straight. Basically, the tape and the laser light, wherever the laser light's pointing, I'm running that tape right along that line. I did the exact same thing, pushing the machine as far forward as it can go. So I pushed it forward, and wherever that laser light hit, I ran that tape nice and straight too. Step 2 is to tape our pantograph to the back table. And we want to center this in that quiltable area. We don't want to take this and put it as close to the back end of the frame as possible. That won't work. So I'm going to place this here right in the center, and we want to make sure it's straight, because if this goes on at an angle, we're going to quilt an angle across our quilt too. So we want to make sure this is nice and straight and running parallel with the rails of the frame. To do this, I'm going to use my laser light again, and I'm also going to use a channel lock. This lock locks the machine so that it can only roll side to side. It can't roll forward and back. So the laser light is pointing on a straight line here marked on the pantograph. So I'm going to place a piece of tape here, making sure that the laser light is lined up with a straight line on the pantograph. Now I'll take the machine and roll it further down, making sure that laser light stays in line with that straight line. I'll tape it down all the way around, making sure that that pantograph is nicely secured. And this is the most important point. After this stage, neither the pantograph nor the laser light should move. These two things are fixed. The only thing that should move from here on out is the quilt and the machine. Step 3 is to quilt across your pantograph. Now, this step requires a little bit of prep on your quilt, and you don't have to have had your quilt on the frame up until this point. It actually makes it a lot easier to put these lines of tape in your pantograph in place when you don't have your quilt on your frame. So once you load your quilt, I advise going ahead and basting it. This is using a big basting stitch on your machine to stitch across the quilt and especially down the sides. The reason is, whenever we're quilting with a pantograph, our eyes are down on the paper and on our laser light. It's not on the quilt. So if your edges are loosey-goosey and you stitch across it, you could very easily flip that edge over and stitch a pleat into your quilt and not even know it until you're all the way across the frame. Another thing you'll want to do before you get started stitching is double check your bobbin, your needle, make sure that your stitches look great. You really don't want to have to run out of bobbin thread halfway through your row, because again, you probably won't notice until you get to the end. So now let's do some quilting together. I'm going to turn on my machine and begin following that line. Now, it's less important to follow the line perfectly as it is to just get a nice, smooth movement. So even if you're not following the line perfectly, and I am definitely not today, that's okay. Your goal is a nice, smooth movement with your arms. Whenever you have a point, a sharp point, or where lines cross, that's a place that you can easily stop and check in. You want to occasionally check in on your stitches. Now, something that definitely helps me have a little bit more control to stay on that line is a frame weight. This is a tube of fabric stitched and filled with rice, and I have 2 of these here just overlapping a little bit. It's giving me a little bit more control, so that way I stay on that line just a little bit better. So here I'm going to keep going. Now your goal here is speed. We want to quilt our all-over quilting design quickly. We want it to look nice, and that fluid movement is going to help us avoid wobbles. So if I really slow down, I tend to get a lot more wobbles and wiggles within the design. If I speed up a little bit, I might not be on the line perfectly, but I'm going to tend to be, I don't know, just a little bit more fluid in that movement. Step 4 is to advance your quilt through your frame. We want to advance the quilt so that way we can stitch the next row and add a little bit of extra spacing between those rows so the stitching doesn't end up on top of itself. First thing and most important thing is that your needle is in the down position. If your needle is in the down position, this means that your long arm, your laser, and your quilt are all going to move together. If your needle is up, your long arm will not move as your quilt moves, which means then you'll be off on your design. Those two things will no longer line up. Your quilt, your laser, and your pantograph will no longer be lining up. So make sure, needle in the down position, and we stitched up to the red line marked on the pantograph. Now I'm going to release my lock, and I'm going to roll the quilt up on my back rail until my laser light is shining on the blue marked line on my pantograph. You may have to fiddle with your cams, your locks a little bit to get this just right, but this is my system for ensuring that each row is evenly spaced. The same amount of open space is set between each row. As long as you stop on the red line and then pull back to the blue line, you're going to be right every single time. With our quilt advanced, now it's time for quilting. But remember to go on ahead and attach your side clamps, put back on any tools like frame weights, so that way you're going to have a consistent experience with each row. Step 5 is to quilt all the way down to the bottom edge of your quilt, following that same pattern of stitching across, advancing the quilt, and making sure that each row is stitched as well as you can. Your bottom row may end up being a partial row. When I'm stitching a partial row, I usually use rulers as a guide to tell me where I need to stop quilting on my pantograph. Now, I'll be completely honest, this is a very condensed, shortened version of what pantograph quilting is all about. So it really does take practice and patience in trying it out on a small baby quilt. I encourage you to give this a try and see what you think of pantograph quilting. If you'd like to read more about this technique, come and check out the March-April 2023 issue of Quiltmaker magazine. Until next time, let's go quilt!